Like magic, there we are. All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the session on the FAIR Principles for Research Software, 3 years on. My name is Neil Chuhong. I'm here with the other two software source code interest group chairs, Moran Grumpeter and Julia Collins, be helping out with this session. I'm just going to start sharing some slides. Okay. So quick rundown of the agenda for today's session. We are going to be doing a little bit of an introduction to what the software source code interest group is about, and then why we are doing this session on the FAIR Principles for Research Software. And then we'll be doing a little bit of an interactive activity, which will help to get an understanding of who else is in the session. Following that, we're going to have a set of free updates on various aspects of the FAIR Principles for Research Software. So both one to start with, looking backwards at the 2-year review that's been led by Tom Honeyman, one looking forward at actionable guidelines for FAIR Research Software by Bhavesh Patel, and then a couple of presentations on some tools for FAIR assessment and assessment of FAIR software by Farouk Dibden and Eleanor Breitmoser. Following that, we're going to have a chance to get some input from you all into where next for FAIR research software and finish off with a bit of a discussion. Quick introduction to the group. So what is the Software Source Code Interest Group? It was set up at the Research Data Alliance as a forum to discuss issues on all aspects of software source code and taking the broader sense of what software source code is. And it's in particular looking at all of the software source code that generates research data and plays a role in research publications. So the purpose of the group is to discuss issues, it's to develop guidelines and publish use cases, and it's to contribute software-related expertise to other groups in the RDA. So it is a nexus point for the discussion around software in the Research Data Alliance. It spins out working groups to look at different areas of these kinds of topics, and that includes things like the FAIR Principles for Research Software and things on software identifiers. And so the reason why we're holding this particular session at RDA is because the Software Source Code Interest Group is also the maintenance home for the FAIR for Research Software Principles. So it's a place where once the work of the working group is completed, it allows for reporting back on progress, concerns, queries about the principles that can come in from the community. So what I'm going to do to start with is just put up a quick interactive poll to get a sense of the other people who are joining us tonight or this morning. So in a little bit, we'll see a Slido come up. So if you go along to the Slido link, slido.com, enter in the code 2677858. I think I've also remembered to put in a link to it in the collaborative notes, or you can use the QR code. I'd like to ask this first question, which is, are you currently using the FAIR Principles for Research Software? And so go and pick the option from the set which best represents your current use of the FAIR Principles for Research Software. And so we have 16 participants. So we've nearly got up to 16 responses. I guess I do not have the ability to put in my response just now unless I whip out my phone. Now I'll wait another 10 seconds. All right. So we have got in this group that we have in the session, a large majority of people who are currently using the FAIR Principles for Research Software, or their organization is using them. we've got some people who are interested in finding out more about them or interested in using them, and some who are planning to use them. It's great to see that no one has answered not planning or interested in using them, because at this point, it's probably time for you to find another session at the RDA. So, all right, let's move on to the next question. So next question is, what's your involvement with the development for the FAIR principles for research software? Again, pick the option that most closely matches your experience. Uh, this is interesting. We've got a pretty even mix between the different categories just now. So this is good. This means that the following presentations and discussion in the section will be very good, because we got people who were both actively involved in the development of the principles, and also those who haven't had any involvement in the development of the principles. Okay, so last little question, not about the principles, but more about you. What sort of roles do you have in your current jobs? And apologies for the sort of the choice of categorizations. If none of them fit, please do pick the other one, but you can pick as many of these as you currently do in your job. Okay. And again, that is quite a range of different roles. So number of people who are researchers or academics or educators, large number who are data stewards or data managers, and people who are managers, research software engineers, other research technical professionals. So a very wide spread of different roles. I think very much in line with what we expect at Research Data Alliance plenary sessions. So, okay. I am now going to stop sharing my screen, and I will hand over next to Tom Honeyman, who's been leading the 2-year review of the FAIR4RS software principles. And he's going to explain a little bit about what's been happening and what some of the outcomes of the work that's been done to look at them have been. So take it away, Tom.
Am I sharing my screen or am I sharing the window?
You're sharing your
Okay,
whole
let me
screen.
try that again. Okay. Okay, that looks better. I assume. I've got the nice green box around the outside. Okay, so I won't give any more context beyond what Neil said. And I just want to acknowledge the following people who have been involved in this review process as well. And so we conducted this survey. We had 63 responses. And this, sorry, I should say the survey is there to determine if the FAIR4RS software principles needed a review. We got 63 responses. There were many issues raised that fell outside of reviewing the principles, which I will also include in this presentation. And when we look at the cross-section of the responses, it was reflective of a broad range of reviews, not unlike what we've already had in this session now. But there is, to the extent that we can tell, still a strong global north bias in engagement with this particular area. That review had two, I guess, core question areas. The first being if or when to review again, and the second being, are the principles effective, or do they need changing? On the question of effectiveness, the survey actually gave us several different lenses for considering whether they're being effective, and I'll be going through the results against these. One way that we could talk about effectiveness is satisfaction. Another is if there was evidence of use or uptake in the responses. Another, again, is there evidence that people are actually understanding the principles as they were intended? And we can see that through feedback on them as well. And then finally, are they actually usable? Are they tractable principles as well? None of these alone really gives us an answer. I think it's really a combination of all of them. So let's have a look at what the results from the survey were. On the question of satisfaction, if we're hard on ourselves and say that the middle point in a Likert scale is a measure of not of satisfaction, then slightly more people were indicated that they were not satisfied with the FAIR principles for research software. And slightly less than half were happy enough to indicate directly that they were satisfied or very satisfied with the state of the principles. That yellow block on the right, people who were neither satisfied nor unsatisfied, but for the purposes of distinguishing satisfaction, I put them over on the right. And that yellow block was, in fact, the largest block of people's responses. Another way of measuring it is to say, well, if it's been effective, then people can recognize that it's been an influence on their work. And in this regard, we had 4/5 of the responses indicating one or more ways in which the FAIR principles were impacting upon their work, while 1 in 5 responded that it was having no influence or impact upon their work. We can further break that down by these categories. So people nominated one or more ways in which they were impacting upon their work across these rough categories that we've put across the bottom there. And just to be clear, I'm talking about the blue bars here, while the people who just responded that there was no impact is that red bar over on the right. Another way that we could look at the effectiveness of the principles is to understand if they're actually understandable. And this is user-reported understandability. So it doesn't mean that they have understood it. It's just they they've indicated that they understand it. And overall, the pattern, when breaking it down by guiding principle, is that each guiding principle was more understandable than not. One exception to flag here on the understandability spectrum is the guiding principle I2, and where we had roughly even understandability and non-understandability at the same time. If we go into the usability here, we would expect that the principles drop off in terms of usability. Even the original FAIR data principles have guiding principles that are difficult or impossible to implement under the status quo. They were anticipating the development of certain infrastructure to enable this to happen. And we do have pretty much the same pattern that you see in the data world in applying the FAIR principles as well, which is to say that the F and the A principles, the findable and accessibility principles, tend to be more actionable, while the I and the R principles tend to be a little bit harder to action. I'm highlighting here in particular I1 and I2 and R3 as problematic above all others here, and that will become relevant in a minute. We also had free text responses. So some of the respondents to the survey did further expand upon what they found difficult or easy to understand or use or act upon in the principles. And I could broadly characterize these as both answers heading in different directions. So there was both an indication that the language of the principles is both vague and at the same time excessively technical. And yet we also had people in roughly equivalent numbers say that the use of high-level concepts are clear and understandable and easy to act on because of that. We did have a block of people who were strongly representing open source practices. And again, which is a subset of the research software world, a reasonably large chunk. And we had, again, sort of feedback in both directions, that it was complicating open source practices, and yet it also complemented, people pointed to specific principles that actually complemented and bolstered open source practices at the same time. Again, where there are gaps and in the tools and infrastructure, people were quick to point out that this made it both difficult to understand and use. But at the same time, there was plenty of feedback that there is some really great points in the infrastructure landscape. People pointed to the use of SWIDs and DOIs, the existence of software heritage, of Zenodo, of GitHub, of software registries. A number of infrastructures were highlighted as making adoption easier in the research software landscape. And then finally, there was also a block of people who were representing strong software engineering principles. Again, not all research software is made with reference to strong software engineering principles. But it was noted that where it did align with good software development practices, this did make the FAIR principles easier to adopt as well. Overall, we got feedback that went not to specific principles, but to I guess, the intent of the FAIR principles overall, FAIR principles for research software overall. There were a small but vocal group of people aligned with that software engineering approach, calling for the incorporation of specific software engineering practices in the FAIR principles for research software. Also with that block of people who were strongly aligned with open source practices, there was a call to make that element more prominent. I'm suggesting here in my analysis that these are both directions that would extend beyond the intent of the original FAIR principles. There were also calls to alter what was already expressed within the FAIR principles for research software. A small group saying that we should embrace reproducibility as a core aim and as a core function of research software as well. And that is actually, if you go back and look at particularly the original paper announcing the FAIR principles, that is actually a solid aim expressed in the paper. So I'm saying that's an alteration to the existing language. Certainly there were calls in many different directions to make the wording easier to understand. And as always, as occurs with the FAIR data principles, there was not much love for the phrase domain relevant community standards, which particularly for people familiar with the FAIR data principles would know that that is also a consistent theme in calling for that wording to be made clearer. To give you a sense of the kinds of things, oh yes, sorry, and there was one other point, pertinent point, which is that we should take this opportunity to expand or transfer the leadership in this activity to give people a chance to have a say in this area. With regards to things that were occurring outside of the activity, there were consistent calls for there to be more funding, to develop infrastructure to fill those gaps, to mandate dependencies as in scope for fairness, that's software dependencies, that is. There was certainly a small block of people who were saying that from their perspective as developers of research software, that we should drop or ignore FAIR altogether. But I'm suggesting that they weren't enough of those people for that to be an expression of the will of the overall community. And there was definitely a strong call in one way or another to create more guidance, to name specific actions for specific types of software, to create mechanisms to enable compliance with the FAIR principles, more tractable kind of metrics. And in regards to that domain relevant community standards, to actually name explicitly what those community standards are. So overall, what I would recommend, or what the group would recommend on the back of having conducted this exercise, is that we really need to see a review with a refreshed leadership for a focused activity, which would draft specific amendments to the most problematic or controversial of language. And they would actually have to then run a robust process to capture agreement on the changed wording. So it still needs to reflect that community will. This activity was just testing the need for it. It didn't actually seek specific changes in wording at this stage, but there are some moments there. But actually, and I think this is relevant to the rest of the session, there is still strong interest in seeing alternative activities to just revising the words of the FAIR principles themselves, FAIR principles for research software themselves, particularly with regards to the interoperability principles and the reusability principle number 3. So we can definitely pick that up later in the discussion. And I think this also tells us that we need to do a good job of promoting the existing activities that are actually trying to address these consistently voiced needs, particularly the research task force that's underway right now, and I think is actually presenting maybe next. Is that right? We asked when the next review would happen, and we got quite a spread of responses. If I interpolate between the responses and the practicality of how long it's taken us to do this review or initiate this review, I would recommend that we do a review in roughly 3 years' time on the back of this particular round. So when we get to the tail end of this process, we should basically flag in the existing governance text, which says that we would review it in 2 years' time after the release of the principles, that in 3 years' time, roughly, that would be an appropriate time. And that's roughly in line with the bulk of the responses that we had from the survey participants as well. Yep, that's me.
Thank you very much, Tom. There's one question in the chat already. I don't know if you want to ask a question yourself, otherwise I can read it out.
I mean, go ahead, you can read it out. I would just a lot of commercial software is not backward compatible. It's nothing but FAIR principles. I was just wondering if there's any consideration or talk about these principles applying to commercial software.
Yeah, so that discussion definitely came up when we were developing the FAIR principles for research software. I'm not sure, well, yeah, particularly for those people that were co-chairs on the activity, I could flick to this one, but being a set of principles, my answer would be that it doesn't necessarily mandate that all principles have to be strictly adhered to across the board. You can talk about software being more or less available, more or less fair, basically. And so commercial software will, as long as it has a license, as long as it's available via an identifier mechanism, can be expressed as moderately fair. I think. Would that be a fair? I might pass back to.
Right. I mean, some parts, yes, definitely they're, complying with the FAIR principles, but accessibility is one issue because obviously you have to pay to get it. It's not open access. And then interoperability is another one. A lot of times they use a proprietary format, so it's not really compatible with or interchangeably used. It's not interoperable. So those are the two areas of
Yep.
FAIR principles that commercial software might not be
Yep.
interested in. Yeah.
So straightforwardly, I would say that they're essentially low on the FAIR spectrum.
Yeah, I think it's some good questions you raised there, particularly on the interoperability, because I think it also depends a little bit on the area that the commercial software is the function that it's addressing. Because in some cases you see a very good uptake of open formats, and in other areas you see very poor, or you see proprietary formats being used commonly, and I think it does vary a lot. So. Sadly, that might well be bringing into play the much hated adheres to community standards. So maybe something for discussion. Do we have any other questions for Tom at this point? We'll have the chance to discuss more as well later. Otherwise, I will ask one last question from you, Tom, before we head on to the next talk, which is, so you noted that there was a high degree of variance in the opinions. So from your perspective, what's the right way of kind of going forward with that? Is it to look at specific things that have caused the most variance of opinion, because they're the ones that seem the most controversial, or is it to look at the things that people have had a lot of agreement on because they'll be the easiest to basically get a fix for, and going through the community process?
So, I mean, this is with regards to, so first of all, I think the FAIR principles, FAIR principles for research software, one of the things that make them strong, but difficult, is that they were achieved via a consensus mechanism. So what that means is that we would expect that there would be people at either end of a spectrum who vehemently disagree with the general direction, and it's something of an aggregate position. And so I'd say that variation is expected. I think if it's skewed strongly in one direction or the other, then I would say that we are not expressing the consensus position of the community. And I think still the answer is less to do with modifying the principles than increasing the quality of the guidance and the specificity of the guidance when it comes to specific communities. However, it's possible that there are, particularly the newest of the principles is perhaps the place that we should focus our energy. So those things that were significant changes to the, which are a very small number, are probably the things that should continue to be checked because they deviate from the original significantly, and that's, I mean, I think we have to ensure that as FAIR is interpreted for research software, that it does express the will of the community on those new items in particular, because they're the most hard to understand. So that's interoperability in particular, and some elements of the reusability.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I think that does lead us in very nicely to the next talk. I'm going to hand over now to Bhavesh, because the work that he's going to be talking about is all around better guidance.
Hey, hi everyone. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Hey everyone. I'm Bhavesh, and I'm going to talk about actionable guidelines for making research software fair. And I'll start with a little bit of background. This is something I've been thinking about for over 3 years now. started in around December 2021. What my team and I do here at the FAIR Data Innovations Hub, our main focus is on developing software that helps researchers make their biomedical research data fair. And so I thought, hey, maybe we should also make our software fair. And especially since the original FAIR principles, if you look at them, it although they're mostly used for data, it does state that it's meant for any research outcome, including software. And so then the question we had is, okay, how do we make our research software fair? And as we were looking about how to do that, what we learned is that many in the research software community felt that the original FAIR principle were not really suitable for software. And so they established what was just discussed now, the FAIR principle for research software, which are a set of 17 principles tailored specifically for research software. And I'm showing a few here now. For instance, software is assigned a globally unique and persistent identifier, and software is described with rich metadata, and so on. And so we thought, hey, great, this is exactly what we were looking for. So let's just apply them to our software to make it fair and then kind of be done with it. But it turns out it was not as easy because we had a lot of questions. And again, this was kind of in the early days of the FAIR4RS about, hey, what identifier I can use for software? We knew for data, typically it's DOI, but for software, we're like, hey, what should we use? And we also had question about, hey, what does it mean to have rich metadata for software and so on? And as we searched for answers, we realized there were no kind of clear guidelines on implementing the FAIR4RS principles. And so me and a few colleagues in the biomedical research field, we kind of said, hey, let's maybe us establish such guidelines. And that's how we established what we call the FAIR Biomedical Research Software Guidelines, which are a set of minimal actionable step-by-step guidelines for complying with each of the FAIR4RS principles. And we kind of worked on it for a while. It took a while because almost a year and a half, because it was kind of a side project. And also because we were kind of getting feedback and kind of keep changing them. And then we started from the first draft of the FAIR4RS principles, but then I think in April 20 or May 2022, there was the final version out. So we're like, oh yeah, maybe we should revisit everything. So it kind of took a little bit of time. But in August is when we published the manuscript on the topic. And we kind of, to establish those guidelines, we kind of did literature review, also had some discussion, presentation at conference, mainly focused on around biomedical research software. And so I'm just presenting here kind of a quick snapshot of the guidelines, but won't have time to go through them. But there's things to do before you start developing the software, things to do while you are developing, and then when you're ready to release the new software. And again, we try to make the guidelines very specific about, hey, use this. For instance, working from a version control system platform like GitHub, having a README, using code meta and citation CFF files, sharing, archiving the source code on Zenodo, and much more. And you can find the full guidelines that are in our paper. And we also kind of developed, well, after we kind of shared the guidelines, people were like, oh yeah, it's still very kind of time consuming and kind of almost annoying to kind of keep thinking about making software fair, because it's something you have to do constantly with each new release. There's a bunch of things you have to remember. And so we also worked, and it's still a work in progress, on a GitHub app that you can install called CodeFair on your repository, and through GitHub issue, will kind of communicate and monitor your repository and tell you there's things that you want to have to do to keep your software fair. And also now has a nice user interface where if there's something you need to address, it'll take you to the CodeFair website where you have a nice interface to address, and also submit a pull request and so on. And so then at that point, we're like, okay, great, we have some guidelines, we're working on a tool, and we're kind of done now. We can kind of get back to the work we're actually getting grants and funding for. But we were not kind of just done yet, because when we were talking about these guidelines at conferences, one feedback we were receiving, mostly from people outside of biomedical research, was that, hey, most of the things you have in these guidelines can apply to any software. So why not just say, hey, these are guidelines for making any software fair? And then my response was mostly that, hey, the people who established those and the way we kind of work with and the community we consulted were mostly focused on biomedical research software. So we were not comfortable saying, hey, we established something that can be used to make all research software fair. But I thought it was a pretty great idea if we could have some more general guidelines rather than some siloed things we do just in biomedical research. And that's why, and through help from the Research Software Alliance, or RISA, I started this task force called the Actionable FAIR4RS Task Force. And we just recently chose this name. So I updated my slides just a few hours ago, actually. So this task force was started. We had our kickoff meeting just in December. So maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago. And as I mentioned, through help from the Research Software Alliance, and the goal is really to establish actionable guidelines to make any research software fair in line with the FAIR4RS principles. And so it's a very ambitious take because we want to have guidelines that can work irrespective of the field and domain of research, but also consider, I think there was a question about how about proprietary software or software that cannot be shared openly under an open source license and so on. And so we are hoping under this task force we'll consider or at least discuss all of these nuances and come up with some guidelines that can kind of satisfy everyone, maybe with some branches for different requirement and so on. And so currently we have about 12 active members that represent different geographical locations and research domain, but we can definitely use more people and more representation. And so if you're interested in joining, please email me. We're having a blast. And then the first cool thing we did is we said, hey, let's first go back to the FAIR4RS principles and kind of make sure we understand them properly. And that's something we did between December and last month. We just completed that in March. And one of the outcome of this effort was that we took the 17 principles and we, through kind of trying to understand them, we classified them into 6 categories that they address, which are listed here. So we thought those principles address things around identifier, metadata for software discovery, standard inputs, outputs, qualified references, metadata for software reuse and license. And for each of these categories, we had many questions, just like the ones and some more that I had when I started this back in 2021 about, hey, what identifier to use, and now what identifier to use for non-open source software or software that cannot be shared openly and things like that. And so the next thing we are doing is we're kind of splitting up into 6 subgroups. Each subgroup will tackle one of these categories and the questions that come with them. And basically through literature review and reaching out to different communities and so on, try to answer all the questions. And we're hoping we'll be kind of done with that around July 2025, and then we'll all come back together with answers to everything, all the questions we have, and then kind of try to combine those questions into guidelines and hopefully share these guidelines for community feedback in September. And we think there'll be some iteration, some multiple version of the draft as we get inputs. And we're hoping to publish the first version in January. And of course, because these are guidelines as opposed to principles, they're more likely to kind of change or more prone to change because maybe we recommend some standards that now has gone or has changed, or maybe a new one more fancy has come out, or we suggest some platform that's not supported anymore and so on. So we're hoping that we'll still establish some process where we can maintain these guidelines more consistently. And we'll soon have a dedicated page for this effort, for this task force on the RESA website, where all of that information, including our outcome and everything, will be linked. And so please keep an eye out for that. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in the different efforts I mentioned, thank the organizer for having me, and also thank, of course, all of you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavesh. And whilst people are thinking of some questions, one quick question. You mentioned to get in touch with you if you are interested in joining in this effort. would you like to kind of give a little bit more detail about the sorts of the sorts of things that the task force is doing? So how often do you meet? What kind of work would people be getting themselves involved in?
Yeah, of course. So we have a monthly meeting, and there's 2 times, I think, to accommodate for people in different locations. So there's kind of technically 2 monthly meeting, but people are divided between the 2. In between them, at the end of each meeting, we kind of define some task. Some are for specific people, or some are for everyone, and so on. And then we kind of work offline to the task in between the meetings. And so I think, for instance, for the first effort, what we were doing is everyone was providing their interpretation of each of the FAIR4RS principles. And then we were trying to decide and discuss during the meeting to kind of address any difference in views and kind of combine into one. For the next effort, if you join now, I think you'll kind of select 1 or 2, or maybe more if you're kind of have the bandwidth, subgroups that you will be part of, and then work with others in addressing the questions that we have identified for each of them. For instance, for the identifier, we had like people have kind of questions about, hey, what identifier apply for software, how to obtain such an identifier, what identifier kind of can I use if a software is not open, and so on. What if I can only share the metadata but not the software itself? So if you're part of this kind of identifier subgroup, you'll be working with others to kind of do literature review and say, maybe you know some other adjacent effort that's already looking into that. So maybe reaching out to them, collaborate to kind of find answers to those questions. So a lot of fun stuff. As I said, we're having a blast. Yeah.
Thank you, Bhavesh. Any questions from the participants so far? I'm
Not a
seeing-
question, but a comment.
Yeah.
I can confirm it's fun. You should join.
There you go. That's an endorsement. So if you'd like to kind of post the email address for yourself either into the notes or into the chat, then I'm sure that you'll get lots of people. Moran, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Bhavesh, for having this talk here, and it's really interesting to look at the guidelines that are online. A question about adoption: do you measure the adoption of the guidelines at this moment? Do you know if many I don't know, teams are using it, or what is your appreciation of the adoption of the guidelines?
Yeah, I don't think, no, we're not doing that. As I said, like it's been most of it like a side work. We don't have any funding or any support, so we kind of try to do most of it. So I don't think we had a chance to kind of say, hey, who's using it and so on. I think for instance, one thing we can track is the software, the GitHub app we are developing, CodeFair, and we can see it's installed on about 400 repositories, GitHub repositories, but I don't know if there's people just testing it out after I talk like today or directly. I think we could do more fine tracking, but we haven't. But maybe that could be something we could also discuss in this task force is here. And that's what I meant with things to maintaining the guidelines. Afterward, it's having a nice way where we could, just like you guys are doing with the FAIR4RS principle, maybe find a way where we can survey the community to hear if they're using it, and if not, why, and what things could be improved. And hopefully with more people involved in this task where we have maybe a bit more bandwidth for such things. But we haven't done that, unfortunately, with the FAIR-BioRS guidelines yet.
Thank you, Bhavesh.
Any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat and we can pick them up later. Otherwise, I am going to hand over now to a couple of speakers to talk around more tools that can look at the assessment of FAIR software and indeed implement actionable guidance. So I'm going to start by handing over to Farouk.
Thank you, Niels. Let me share my screen. Do you see my slides?
Yes.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is FAIR4RS. I work for the Netherlands Design Center based in Amsterdam. I'll be presenting 2 practical tools that help assess fairness in research software. One of them is FAIR4RS. The other one is self-assessment checklist. I'll be starting with FAIR4RS, but I would like to give you some background first. Back in 2019, eSign Center and DANS introduced fairsoftware.eu website. And in this website, we had 5 recommendations to make software more fair. And those recommendations were using publicly accessible repository, adding a license, registering your software in a community registry, having citation for your software, and also using software quality checklist. And after having those recommendations, naturally, the next question was, how can we automatically check if projects are following those recommendations? So to answer this question, we introduced FAIR4RS. This is basically a Python package available on PyPy. This is a command line application. You can install it with pip. And then on your command line, you just point to a repository, either on GitHub or GitLab, and then you'll have assessment. Here, assessment is basically checking compliance with those 5 recommendations. And after the assessment, you'll get a badge like this. Each circle in those badges refer to those recommendations. And depending on the compliance level, you'll get a different color. And currently, there are about 400 badges on GitHub, but unfortunately, we cannot check self-hosted instances of GitLab because FAIR4RS does not support this. But I believe it will be a similar number for GitLab as well. We also have a GitHub action that is something you can add to your workflow, CI/CD workflow, and then you can get automated assessment. Whenever you make a change in your code, this GitHub action will be triggered and you'll get a new assessment. There is also a cloud service. This is something new. If you don't like to install anything, you can use the cloud service. It provides an interface, web interface, and also a dashboard that you can check the compliance, but it can also gather some extra information via APIs, such as community health and all sort of other information. If you would like to help, you can give it a try. All you need to do is logging in with your GitHub account and then run some assessments and then provide feedback. This is the website. You can just go to www.fairfours.com and then log in and then run some assessments. The other tool that I would like to mention is not fully automated, but self-assessment checklist. And this is a result of collaboration between Netherlands Design Center and Australian Research Data Commons. And this work was done by my former colleague, Jurian Spox and Tom Honeyman. Essentially, it helps you to promote transparency with having a badge. And while filling the form, you'll also discover some good practices, and you'll be an ambassador of FAIR software by setting a visible example. This is how it works. You start filling the form, and at the bottom, you can already see the compliance level. depending on your answers. And you need to answer those questions for all of these aspects of FAIR. And when you finish the checklist, you'll get a badge, which you can copy and paste and add it to your repository. If you have any suggestions on this checklist, you can also provide feedback by going to GitHub repository or just by clicking this button on the website. And I really highly recommend you to give it a try and also promote it, because this is one of the things we still need to do. Feature work for FAIR4RS, I think we still need to align FAIR4RS with FAIR4RS principles. And this is something I'm actively working on. I'm working on very modular version of FAIR4RS, in which communities can also develop plugins. And for for self-assessment checklist, I think we need to do a bit of community work to increase the adoption. I think this is all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Farouk. Do we have some questions for you just now, or should we ask for the? Oh, we've got a question coming up there. So yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, this is very interesting. I'm a data curator for institutional data repository. So we, generalist repository, we can accept any kind of, data, including code. But everybody goes to GitHub, of course, because they can, get the DOI and everything. So having this plugin to check the fairness is great. The one thing that popped into my mind, though, I don't know if you're aware of a data curation network. So yeah, so they actually publish something called Primer. So that actually gives you curated steps to curate data, including code, to make it fair. And then at the end, they check the how fair is it. So if you can incorporate that, that'd be great. So you could participate in creating a primer for research software applying your tool. And that'll actually increase the awareness of your tool and reach broader community.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Would you mind sharing some contact information with me?
Sure. I will share it here, but also I can get you the website for the DCM primer, and I want you to take a look at it and see if this is something you can do. Hang on a second.
I'll just check just now. Are there any other questions just now on this? Otherwise, I'll let Eleanor get set up for, to talk about another tool, and then we might have some more discussion around tooling to help people make their software more fair.
Can I just raise on the back of that, that there is still a kind of unresolved, I wouldn't say problem, but additional area to explore in FAIR, which is the separation of object types when we talk about making things fair, or the unification. So there are some areas of research which combine data and code together to produce a research compendium, I think is one of the terms that gets used, particularly in the social sciences. And this isn't, it's an interesting question as to what constitutes fair in that zone, because on the one hand, the total bundle represents the ability to see both the data and how it was analyzed in one go. On the other hand, by not separating out and treating separately the code and the data, you limit the separate reproducibility of those elements. So the idea that the data could be referenced and combined with a different set of code or that the code could be applied to a different set of data becomes harder when the total object is referred to by a single DOI and or packaged in a way that combines them together. Just wanted to put a pin in that.
Yeah, I think that's something that we should come back to in the discussion, because I think increasingly there are these kind of complex objects, and I think the challenge of what does it mean to make things fair then comes down to the principles and ethos around it versus the actual way of making this actionable or automated, which becomes much
Practical
harder.
as well. Yeah, particularly for instance, machine learning workflows, which are, complex objects as well.
All right. Eleanor, would you like to share your screen?
Yeah, I hope you, let me see.
Yeah.
Hope you can see it.
Yeah, that looks good.
Perfect. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Elena Breitmoser. I'm from the University of Edinburgh, and I worked together with Neil. And there were several colleagues from EPCC who have been working on this project, actually. This presentation is about tools for fair assessment, just as Farouk's, but I will be talking about the extension of the Fuji tool for research software. So this work was all done within the FAIR Impact project, a 3-year project which is about to come to an end. We started with our first deliverable, which was the definition of the metrics on which are based on the FAIR4RS software principles. This was the base for all the follow-on work. We came up with 17 metrics, and both domain agnostic ones and those for domain-specific ones. And we had the social sciences as an example for that. Before we came to step 2, we actually came to step 3, which was the additional report we published, which was a comparison of tools for automated FAIR software assessment. We looked at 4 tools, which was Fuji, How Fair Is, Fair Enough, and Fair Checker. And the only one at the time which actually assessed the fairness of research software, not just data or other digital objects, was How Fair Is. And then we chose out of these 4, we chose Fuji, which brings us to the second step, which was the implementation of some of the metrics we had developed in the first step into this automated assessment tool. And then we had the chance at the end, through this research software support action call, to have like 11 participants across Europe from different scientific backgrounds to actually check it out and test our tool and get some useful feedback from them. So Fuji, the automated assessment tool for the fairness of research software. Originally, as I said, it's an extension what we did. The original, it was the assessment tool just for data. If you follow this web link, it brings you to their web page here on the right-hand side. And the next version release, though, should include our changes, which includes research software. And these are available through a web client, both versions. And the data one is based on metrics for FAIR's FAIR, while our Fuji extension is based on the FAIR4RS software principles. Not all the metrics have been implemented, both the general agnostic and the domain-specific ones. But in our milestone 5.6, which is also available on Zenodo, you can read all the details about the implementation process we went through. So these are the 17 metrics we came up with. I don't want to go through in any detail, don't worry. I'll just let you know that we focused on number 13 and 15, and you will see that both of them are centered about the reusability component of fairness. So this is a demo. Unfortunately, it can't be a live demo, and we only had it on our local server. This should ideally be available in the future when it will be merged to the with the main branch of the Fuji4Data. What you have here, this is where you get on the website, and as a next step, you just plug in here the URL of any repository you would like to be assessed. For the time being, this can only be GitHub repositories. It should be relatively straightforward to extend this to GitLab and Zenodo, for example, but there hadn't been any time and money to push this any further within that project, unfortunately. So what would an output look like? Overall, here you see, for this example, URL, you got less than 9%. For our implementation, there is also an upper limit. You can't get beyond roughly 12 or 13% because only 2 out of the 17 metrics in total have been implemented. And on the right-hand side here, you see that only the reusability, 1 out of the FAIR principles, got any points. So 4 out of 16, all the others have 0. And so the FAIR level here is lit up as yellow and not just orange. You will also find a more detailed report. This is just the start of the report. So it will list all of the FAIR for research software metrics, all the 17 metrics, and explain to you your result. So in this case, if you scroll a bit further down, you will here get all the details for the FAIR for research software metrics number 15. With a breakdown, you see here all the 3 metrics, the 3 sub-metrics, basically. It's looking at the first one, the license is included, so it just gets a simple green tick. The same for the last one is the license format. It is SPDX format. The middle one has not been implemented because it's actually much more challenging than just checking for a license in a special format to see if the software has subcomponents, to find them, are they bundled with it, and do actually these components also have their separate licenses? So this is probably one of these metrics which is more challenging to implement. And if you have a look lower down, you see in green the ones which succeeded. And for all those which have not been implemented, there is already a skeleton in place. So you won't just get an error message or some undefinable, unexplainable message, but it will tell you that it has not been implemented explicitly. On the good news of things, it looks very likely that our colleagues from UPM in Madrid might have the capacity to continue the implementation beyond the proof of concept, which would be great. And this also brings me to the last slide, which is the feedback on Fuji we received from the open call. And there was definitely interest and need for automated FAIR assessment tools. This also brings us again to, it would be great if someone could implement more or all of the remaining tests, which hopefully will be done in Spain. See, there is still the necessity to keep all these inputs human readable. It can't just be machine readable information. And another point which was raised several times was the need for transparency and precise guidelines. So the user has to know what exactly is and what is not measured. Why does, for example, the repository fail for a given test? If you just get a fail, it doesn't really help you. You have to understand what you can do as a user to improve it, and ideally to improve it quickly. And last but not least, several people got different scores for very similar repositories. And this again falls into transparency and making it obvious for the users and easy for the users. Okay, these are just the references, and thank you. Are there any questions?
Any questions for Eleanor? Whilst people are thinking, I have one for both you and Farouk, which so in both cases there's been an element of scoring for this because it is about metrics and assessment. Do you think that kind of scoring helps, or is it something that can lead to undue attention to particular parts of FAIR, given the sort of discussion that came up earlier around Tom and Bhavesh's talks?
I think that's a very good question. It really depends how you explain scoring. If RSEs or people working on those code bases perceive it as a way of showing the state of your software transparently, there is no harm. But when people start using this to punish or reward developers, then you'll have a problem. So far, we didn't have such a case. The feedback we got so far was quite positive. But I can see if you have a scoring system, then things can get quite complicated, especially if funders also start to use this.
Yeah. Elena, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think we also had this discussion at various places, and I think our takeaway from this was like, if you compare one of you, always the same repository for yourself, and you look at the score and try to increase and improve the score over its development, that might be useful for you. But already, if you compare two of your repositories, it shouldn't become a competition, and it can be very misleading and might not give you what you're really after.
Thank you. Tom, got a question.
I just have to frame the ARDC stuff in opposition to that approach, and I'm happy to talk about the shortcomings of the choices that ARDC made as well. But particularly the ARDC self-assessment tool for data, which we were one of the, or they, sorry, I no longer work for the ARDC, but they were one of the early movers in providing tools for measuring FAIR by releasing that tool. And they took a conscious approach of, we have this tool here as a tool of engagement, which is to start conversations or to spark thoughts about what would be the next action to take in making things fair. But the way that it was received, and it's consistently characterized this way, is that it is a metrified approach. So people went in and dug under the code and worked out what weightings had been given to things and said, oh, well, this is how they have created metrics for FAIR, when that absolutely wasn't the intent. The tool gives a visual indicator, and it was built into the tool that you could never fill the bars. It was always the case, and we know this, and we should know this, because FAIR calls for things that are impossible under the status quo, that you can't be fully compliant with FAIR right now. But yeah, it still ended up being a metric, I will say, so best intentions, yeah. And we took the same approach with the software, but that was a difficult conversation backwards and forwards between myself and Yurian to develop that tool.
Yeah, so many different questions. So we've got a question from Lars saying, have you seen any effects for unexperienced developers with the risk of gamification of the developing cycle, or has it contributed to a more structured development? Whilst people are thinking, I can say something. So I was reflecting a little bit of this on a panel that was at the Research Software Engineering Conference last year around FAIR training. And I think we did see some interesting things from the people who had been delivering specifically FAIR software training. And I think one of the things that we came to realize is perhaps we shouldn't be delivering FAIR software training. And what I mean by that is that we shouldn't be labeling it as FAIR training. We should simply be labeling it as all, delivering training and all of the things that help to make your software more fair. And then that helps with the sorts of getting across concepts to less experienced developers in a way that doesn't throw them all the way into the FAIR principles, when what they really wanted to know was how to make sure that their software was better described, or had a license. And in some ways, I've come full circle on the Netherlands eScience Centre work on the kind of like 5 recommendations, where originally I thought it was too simplistic, and I've now personally come right the way around to going, actually it's not simplistic enough. So I've gone the full journey over the last 5 years with FAIR for research software. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah. Tom?
If I, yes, I think you're right. When it comes to those aspects of FAIR that are universal across software types, but I think there's also an opposite argument, which is to say that one of the problems that we face consistently in research software, and actually in data as well, is that applying FAIR to different types of software sometimes it points us in opposite directions. And when we get to that layer of guidance, if it is going to be deeper and more detailed, I think it needs to be consciously narrower in scope as well, which is to say that I would, and I'm on record about saying this, but I would like to see specific guidance that really consciously targets analysis code as quite separate to dealing with, say, complex infrastructural type software or commercial tools even, where you basically say, look, I'm not trying to solve this for all of research software at once. I'm really just zeroing in on this specific area, which is the kind of nuance that we need for this to be more tractable when we have such a complex beast that we're trying to characterize.
And it is the sort of way that some organizations like the German aerospace centers went. Lars, do you want to respond to that at all, or else I'll bring in Lindsay?
Oh, it's fine. I just wanted to kind of brace the question and get people thinking about how we deal with inexperienced developers as these, or entry-level developers. I personally give a course in programming formalism, so that's why I have a sort of vested interest in this. But yeah, I think it's an important part to sort of think on, okay, what are the implication and effects when we do these things for the people that are coming into the field, so we can help them develop in the correct way, so to speak.
Yeah, and I put a note in the docs about the fact that I think one of the things that was clear from some of the stuff that Tom was talking about earlier is that we've got people coming from different backgrounds now with different expectations. So people who are coming from more of a software engineering, software development background, who will look at the FAIR principles and go, this does not go far enough in this direction. And then we'll have people coming from the data kind of curation and data stewardship side, which will say that it's not going far enough in a different direction. So we're stuck in the middle. Lindsay, do you want to comment?
I had a quick question. So, and hopefully no one cringes at this question, but working in sort of like data curation, but also I work a lot with developers building infrastructures and workflow developments. And so I'm often the one who's connecting the data world with the software. And I think one thing that's kind of challenging, I work in a lot of terminologies, and there's nothing that really well describes in a terminology base the types of things that go on with the software development. So like FAIR4RS is really great because it calls out certain elements, but there's no terminology to define it for those who need to either programmatically understand it or connect things between. And I was kind of wondering if like that was something anyone's brought up, and maybe that would help sort of draw some clarity with like language, what that looks like, what that development is, to sort of just connect a cohesive understanding of things. Because as far as I know right now, there isn't one. And it would be really great there were terms that did describe the level of complexity, even like some of the things that Tom had brought up. How do you know what kind of analysis software or extension this builds into? And you just don't know. So yeah.
In fact, it's interesting because I almost have the opposite perception, which is that the challenge is that there are too many of these different definitions and frameworks. I know, so further up in the chat, further up in the chat, for instance, Moran posted a link to a document of work that she led around just how you define what research software is and where the boundaries were, and then also around how you define reuse and other aspects of fairness in that. But then, just now we've got a large argument going on in terms of trying to, in a project called eVerse, which is a European project on research software quality, where we're trying to bring together a number of different definitions coming from software engineering, from industry, from the sort of data side as well, and trying to almost map between the terminology that's used in each of them, and it's hard. So yeah, it's a tricky one. I absolutely agree. If we could get to something like that, it would be great.
Yeah, and I think the things that exist now, like there's a couple that are out there, but they're subject domain focused, right? Like something more agnostic, like even down to describing like nodes in some sort of particular software graph component. Like, so something more geared towards subject agnostic application specifically. Yeah, because I think, and less even focused around FAIR, which is like if you can identify it clearly and make connections, then you can assess it a little more properly. Yeah, so if anyone does anything with that, I would be interested because I think it's fascinating to map between, the jargon and the application.
Yeah. So certainly there's one piece of work that's gone on that you should talk to Moran about called Code Meta, which maps between all of the different descriptive terms for software across lots of different kind of frameworks for describing software, and attempts to make that all kind of into a nice, clean schema. But yeah, I think there is work that's going on there, but perhaps it's not quite addressing the point that you made. It's looking to solve slightly different problems. Okay, where are we with the hands now? Xianyang?
Yeah, I really like Lindsay's suggestion about having a standardized ontology for software. And I just want to add something to that. If you, for biomedical research, mesh terms are the best keywords because it has unique identifiers associated with it. So if you can have something like that, if someone develops, for example, ontology for software specific, terms and have a unique identifiers associated with their terms, it'll really clean up things and standardize and make it machine actionable. So I don't know where's the best platform for that, but something that comes into my mind is a fairsharing.org because it's very structured, has a relationship graph and everything. So maybe you can discuss with Allison. She would maybe give you good guidance about that.
I think I feel like this is something definitely where if there is kind of enough critical mass of people who can be drawn from the different communities together, that there could be progress made there. So maybe that is a thought for a future working group or task force to look at, because I do think it's a good idea. Maybe it's something that will come out of the work that we've heard earlier around actionable guidelines, is that there'll be a recommendation for doing some additional work in one area. Okay, Eleanor, did you have something else to say, or has that now been covered?
It hasn't been covered, but it's getting back to Lars' original comment, and it was about when we had the open call, and a lot of participants, they didn't just use the Fuji implementation, which covered only the 2 metrics, but they went through the whole list of all of the 17 metrics and commented back on them. And many of them came to the conclusion that you can actually already cover relatively easily about 50% of fairness by just like having your code in a repository, by adding a license to it, by having a README and using something like Code Meta, for example.
Right. I'm going to kind of start bringing this towards an end. And what I wanted to do before we finished was put up a couple more questions to get your input in on. And it's sort of taking this discussion further forward. So I'm just going to share my screen again. Okay. And so what I'm interested in hearing about now is you've heard a lot about the sort of principles and what people have thought about them through the work that Tom Honeyman presented. You've seen a lot around different tools, and we've had this discussion about some of the challenges. So the first question here is, in your mind, what's stopping greater adoption of the FAIR principles for research software? Okay, awareness is taking a strong lead. Learning curve, benefit, yeah, guidance. Yeah, it's always about time. Literacy as well. Some are tired of hearing FAIR. Yes, that is it's a very good point. More on guidance. Yeah, so specialization into different communities. Right. I can see there's still a few more things. I'm going to ask you to kind of put in your last ones now. Yeah, maybe we should just get it part of the cookie cutter project, and then it will just be part of the setup of a project. Success stories. That's good point. That's something here where we're very happy to kind of make them more public through the software source code interest group and others. So yeah, so I think here there's a lot around awareness. There's a lot around giving a clear benefit. So I'm going to move on to the final question for today, which is building on all of that discussion we've just had. So if we're looking at awareness and benefit as being the kind of two key things that are stopping greater adoption, what should we be doing in the next 3 years as a community? So someone please do put in having a better ontology or folksonomy process. But what else do we want? Okay. Hands-on training. Perfectly fair software. Is there such a thing as a perfectly fair software? Or is there such thing as a perfectly fair software which is a useful piece of software? Highlighting examples with return on investment. Have an IG meeting displaying adoption success stories. That's certainly a really good idea. Tools for making software fair. Yeah, automatic registration of 2 eyes. And I think some of that, like code fair, is heading in that direction. More recognition. Yeah, there's the clear terminology. Okay, I'm going to close this in 30 seconds, so please do put in your last suggestions. Yeah, support by infrastructure like registries. Okay, going once, going twice. All right. Thank you very much for that. It has been a really great session. Thank you for your active participation. Thank you so much to all of the people who are presenting, particularly those of you for whom it is now very early in the morning or very late at night. Thank you to all of my co-chairs as well for helping organize this session and helping to take notes, and to the RDA for allowing us the space to have this discussion. And most of all, I think thank you for everyone for being so interested in the FAIR for Research Software Principles. We've had them for 3 years, and now the question is what we can do to take them forward for the next 3 years. And yes, so what I'm hoping to do with the slides is to collect them. I've got them from most people, but we'll try and put them all into a bundle that will go up on the software source code interest group pages on the RDA website. So with that, we are at time. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the other sessions that you're participating in the Research Data Alliance. And I will say goodbye now, and thank you to you all.